Have you started recording?
Yes, sir.
Wonderful. So yes, this meeting is being recorded. Thank you all so much for attending this meeting. We really appreciate your involvement and interest in this effort. The purpose of this workshop is twofold. First, to provide an overview of the project to the public and start conversations with our county's communities. And two, to solicit some additional feedback from the public as we launch this effort. There will be multiple opportunities in the future to engage with this project, and we look forward to updating and receiving feedback from you all over the next few months. Today, we will go through a variety of items on the project. First, start with some introductions, dive into the project background, provide an overview of the project components, take a look at the survey, and then dive into some discussion questions and next steps. One way to interact during this workshop will be to use the chat feature. Also, you will be able to raise your hands and speak up, particularly in the latter half as we open it up for Q&A. With us today is a great team of individuals with plenty of experience throughout Santa Barbara County. The names on this list are the primary individuals who are moving this project forward. At the lead on this project is the County of Santa Barbara Office of Emergency Management, or OEM. And hired as a consultant on this project is Wood. With OEM, we have Mike and JD. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Sure, thanks, Matt. Mike Dyer. I'm a technical specialist in County OEM. I was the previous project manager on the last hazard mitigation plan, also the retired county fire chief.
Thanks, Mike. My name is JD Saucedo, everybody. Welcome to this workshop. I'm an emergency manager here for the Santa Barbara County Office of Emergency Management, and will be supporting Mike Dyer throughout this project's development. One piece of housekeeping I do want to mention is that for those of you who would like, we do have real-time Spanish interpretation available for the duration of this workshop. If you look to the bottom of your Zoom kind of screen bar, you'll see an interpretation button, or it might say English at this point, but if you click that, you can toggle into a room that will have translation provided as we proceed throughout this evening. Thank you for your time, and back at you, Matt.
Thanks, JD. As for Wood, we have a number of technical specialists who have assisted in the update of other HMPs throughout California and the nation, and the team on this project is based out of downtown Santa Barbara. We'll be supported by GIS specialists out of Colorado and also technical staff here in Santa Barbara. Doug, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Matt. Doug McFarling. I'm a senior program manager in Wood's Santa Barbara office. And in addition to having lived and worked in Santa Barbara for over 30 years, I'm also within Wood's structure. I'm one of our senior program managers on 2 of our nationwide FEMA contracts. So I have a good working familiarity with hazard mitigation planning and issues that we'll be looking at and working on over the next several months. Happy to be here. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Doug. Also with us today, we have Gina, who is assisting and will be corresponding in chat throughout this workshop. In order to participate, you can enter a question in the chat box. You can also raise your hand by clicking the options at the bottom or sometimes top of your screen using the Zoom application. For the most part, questions entered into the chat box will be saved and responded to for the most part during the Q&A near the latter half of this workshop. Additionally, as stated previously, there is a recording of this meeting that will be available afterwards, along with contact information for the people on this call for any additional questions that may come up. So, why are we here today? As you are all aware, the County of Santa Barbara is no stranger to disasters. A few years ago, the Santa Barbara to Carpinteria region was doubly hit by fires, followed by rain and associated debris flows. Offshore infrastructure presents the threat of oil spill, and coastal erosion from sea level rise threatens the county's onshore infrastructure and assets. The northern region of the county frequently experiences high heat exposure events, and at the present, we are in the midst of a global pandemic that has caused stress on hospitals and general hazard response, product supply lines, and human interaction. The money invested in prevention before these disasters hit can help save much higher costs that could occur during recovery from a disaster that actually had no preparation. Acknowledging and addressing these trends is crucial to preventing high costs of response and recovery. Due to the predictable and repetitive nature of most natural hazards, and even some anthropogenic hazards, disasters can be effectively avoided or planned for. For instance, the boundaries of a high fire hazard area can help plan for city development build-out, extents, and fire department response zones. The same concept can be applied to potential flood zone areas or areas that could be inundated over time from shoreline encroachment. More recently, preparing for pandemic-related disasters, whether it be gloves or masks, can help to accommodate those disasters when they hit later on. Avoiding areas that are identified as having high risk can The reason that hazard mitigation plans exist is based on the Disaster Mitigation Act of the year 2000. It requires local governments to have HMPs and enables local jurisdictions to receive funding that may help to prepare for or accommodate pre- and post-disaster occurrences. This HMP plan is folded into the county and local jurisdictions planning mechanisms, and it plans for future development where you can build your neighborhoods, build critical infrastructure projects within the county, and reduce losses long term. A few related items include these state regulations that guide HMPs, including SB 379, which addresses climate change. There are also state regulations addressing environmental justice, wildfire risks, evacuation routes, residential neighborhoods and hazard areas, and climate adaptation over the years. And all of this gets folded into this HMP update process. FEMA is somewhat at the head of all this. FEMA has a recommended 4-phase approach to updating a jurisdiction's HMP. The update over the next year and a half will use this recommended approach. Importantly, the outreach and engagement element under phase 1 and throughout the whole process is happening right now, and we are participating in. It's a process that continues throughout the update, and we look forward to both this time and the next few times that we meet. Project partners. All 8 cities and 4 special districts within the county will be involved with the HMP update. Quasi-governmental and non-governmental organizations such as the Red Cross or volunteer organizations active in disaster are also integral to these disaster preparedness and hazard planning efforts. Today is the first meeting with the public. You guys here today, public stakeholders, and we aim to both inform and receive input from you all this evening. To briefly go over the process, first, the team identifies hazards that can threaten our community. The hazards are generally described, their potential occurrence is determined, and the estimated frequency is established. While there are standard sources of information associated with fire hazard boundaries, earthquake faults, and landslides or liquefaction maps, more recent and novel studies have been conducted involving sea level rise, which include consideration for coastal erosion and storm flooding, and energy resiliency studies, which include assessments of the existing energy support infrastructure and potential weak points in an attempt to reduce power outages or other cutoffs of connections to the community that could be exacerbated in the event of a disaster. The displayed table here is included in the county's current 2017 plan. It identifies the hazards that would involve the highest probability and impact, along with those that would result in the lowest probability and impact. This table will be updated in the 2022 update throughout this year and the beginning of next. As you may notice, though a pandemic and epidemic category is mentioned in the existing 2017 plan, it was not even included in this table. After the past year, it could probably be seen as having a pretty high impact, though with low probability. You'll each have an opportunity to weigh in on the prioritization of hazards during this 2022 update. Second, we conduct a risk assessment. The risk assessment identifies the hazards we will profile in the HMP and determines the potential impacts of hazards to the people, economy, and built and natural environments of the county. This part of the plan asks what can happen here and what can happen that may affect critical infrastructure. We use the best publicly available information and science-based data sources to inform the risk assessment and have begun outreach to each of you through the use of surveys and email outreach and social media. And we are looking forward to discussing more today. After we profile the hazards, our team models what has the potential to be affected to see what is vulnerable. This assessment is based on a critical asset inventory, essentially a inventory of all the things within the community that we can't go without. That is the water supply, that is our wastewater treatment, and so on. The assessment is based on the asset inventory and also the county's mitigation capabilities assessment. And what that means is it is an assessment of the county's ability to respond to various disasters. For instance, in the event of a flood, does the county have a flood preparedness plan? Or in the case of a pandemic, is there something that the county has to guide the response or preparation of such a disaster? This part of the plan summarizes the impacts created by the interaction of the natural hazards and county key assets. We want this overlap to be as small as we can so we can lower the county's risk. Using this information, after identifying the hazards and assessing their potential impact and weighing the resources available to mitigate their impacts, we work together to develop a mitigation plan. This will come a little later in the process and will not be addressed today, but in order to provide the overview, the very first step is setting planning goals. All mitigations identified should be established with the intent to support those goals. The mitigations will be created to at least address those hazards earlier identified as high priority. Mitigation actions and alternatives, such as improving a local area's storm drain system so that it can accommodate longer storms, or improving public information, such as using the newest technology and outreach to inform the public of imminent or ongoing disasters. Alternatives will be considered and a draft action plan will be created. The available types of mitigation projects include plans and regulations that need to be created or updated, or identifying infrastructure projects that can increase community safety. It also includes promoting education and awareness initiatives and protecting the county's existing natural systems. Once identified, the plan's actions must be prioritized. And there are a range of questions to ask in selecting the appropriate mitigation measures, most directed at making it the most effective and actionable plan. Will the mitigation make a difference? Is it feasible? Will it last? Is there any support for this? How difficult might this be to implement? If it is difficult, is it worth it? And mitigation is, for those that may be unaware, is just trying to mitigate the potential for something to happen, to reduce the potential for something to happen. It's the action of constructing something or making a plan to reduce the potential for something bad to happen. The final step is adopting and implementing the plan. It incorporates all the public feedback that has been delivered or solicited to the update team. It involves coordinating with the local jurisdictions that the project team members that had been described a little earlier in this presentation. And finally, it's implementing the plan. And since these plans are updated about every 5 years, it takes action and involvement from each participating jurisdiction to monitor and evaluate changes or report on progress and look forward to the revision in the next cycle. So to summarize, we will first engage local stakeholders. We will update the plan in line with existing requirements and assess the hazards that can affect our community. We will assess how much progress was made on previously established mitigation actions and update the plan with new actionable measures. And overall, our main goal is just to improve the document wherever possible. The next time we meet, following the summer of data acquisition and becoming more informed about what needs to be updated within the plan, will be in late summer or early fall of this year. We will be soliciting public input for ideas on what sorts of mitigation approaches would be most appropriate to handle the various identified hazards. And by that time, we will gather again to prioritize those hazards that may most immediately affect our community. In early winter, we will attempt to finalize the mitigation actions that will address the hazards and discuss the draft plan. All of this will be incorporated in early 2022 and go through the final multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan adoption process. It is quite the mouthful. As stated previously on the last slide, the next meeting is scheduled for end of August-ish, and we'll stay in contact via email, via social media posts, and via website updates as we approach that date before finalizing. We also have a public survey, and we appreciate the handful of responses we have received thus far. Input has been thoughtful and helpful as we move forward. We encourage anyone and everyone with an interest in this process, and considering you are here, that's probably all of you, to engage, participate, contribute, etc. Widespread public participation and community engagement will ensure we wind up with the most useful, complete, and applicable plan update. Thank you all. At this point, we're going to open it up a little bit into public participation and questions. At this time, it's possible to provide your input. You can use the chat feature, or you can raise your hand using the Zoom features. To prime some of the questions to start out, this is the whole list of hazards in the existing county HMP. Except for the ones in bold, those are at the state level and may be included, but there are not too many volcanoes in the area around us, nor avalanches. Those topics and areas that are looking to be included and beefed up in the plan out of some initial internal discussions are those related to anthropogenic hazards, such as IT vulnerability and cybersecurity, and energy reliability and energy resiliency. Our county has experienced a number of blackouts over the past few years, and trying to increase the resiliency to those types of events would be great within this plan. Another item is food security. For instance, in the city of Carpinteria, following the 2018 debris flows, Carpinteria went nearly 3 weeks without being able to restock grocery stores. And that led to a level of panic in the community. Another item is disadvantaged communities, as those power outages and food security concerns may disproportionately affect communities that are disadvantaged in our county. And finally, reconsidering the hazard priorities. It's one of the purposes for this discussion today, and will also come up during the next public workshop in mid to late summer, approaching fall. So with that all said, what are some other topics that you can think of that would require additional consideration? From the chat, and I am not personally able to see the chat myself. However, another way to think about this question is what are some local hazard events that have affected your community? Are there events that have occurred that have impacted you specifically, or are there areas that you can think of that need some additional input? Heading back to the slide of the range of hazards in our community, you can take a look over here, and if there is something that comes to mind, whether it be from the pandemic that you want to see addressed by the county, that would be worthy to be included. If you live near one of the high fire hazard areas or have experienced the debris flows personally, that is also welcome to be contributed to the discussion. We have a hand raised from Kelly Hubbard.
Hi, Matt. Can you hear me?
Yep.
You mentioned that you can't see the chat. Someone included that disability access and functional need considerations before, during, and after emergencies should be considered. Additionally, although it's in here, just as I was talking today with I came from the water utilities previously in Orange County, and so I think looking at drought, but also how climate change may be affecting some of these. And I know you have climate change, but also the concept that climate change can affect each of these hazards potentially, or many of them. And so how do we incorporate those, I think, would be a new consideration of how we prioritize, was one of your questions.
Yeah, the climate change topic in particular, it's especially with regards to sea level rise near the coastal areas. There have been a number of studies and workshops over the last 5 years or so, with the most up-to-date data from the state level that indicates over the next 100 years or so, we should anticipate some higher C. And yes, as I'd indicated before, while I'm sharing my screen, I don't have personal access to the chat. So if there are additional questions, thank you, Gina. So
Matt, there's
regarding drought,
Oh.
yeah,
I'm sorry, I was just going to pass
fine.
on another comment from the chat room is emergency communications for those who don't have technology and rely on landlines, specifically the elderly or the DAFN community. So I think that's something we've sort of touched on one of the things we've talked about elevating as a new thing to be considering. IT vulnerability is sort of related, at least. So that's something to weigh on or think on. And I'm going to reading this straight from the chat room. Another one from Jordana Ray. I hope I got that right. Are our numerous agencies able to work seamlessly? Are they ready to respond, such as with a wildfire? Is there a list of agencies that a team will need to call, which would include Red Cross, Animal Services, and other response agencies? So, and now I see that Gina is putting those onto the screen. So I'll let you take the microphone back. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. For emergency communications, and those who don't have access to technology, are there specific approaches that are suggested by those in the chat or that want to speak about suggestions of ways to increase our ability to reach out to them? We've relied so much recently on all these technological features to reach out to everyone that is it knocking door to door? Is it flyers?
So some of this obviously will be or things that need to be addressed in our emergency response plan, not necessarily in the hazard mitigation plan, but understanding these and how they influence the hazards and then so that they're identified, and also potentially for mitigation projects. So if we can identify solutions to some of these problems using the criteria you mentioned earlier, those would be potentially mitigation projects that we can put in the hazard mitigation plan.
Hello.
Yeah,
I have something to add about your question about what would be the best way to do outreach to these communities. And mailers are great, but keeping in mind the community of people that have low vision or are blind, they will not be able to read those materials. So multimodal is the best. We've been getting a lot of, we've been providing a lot of assistance to people with disabilities, and we've been putting on public service announcements with local TV stations. So there are a lot of avenues to take on this, but I would say having the information that people need set up with 211 will be a best practice. So when 911 doesn't work, they'll have somewhere to call.
okay. Yeah, in fact, I am not personally aware of 211, so that is interesting to hear.
211 is a social services call number. It's pretty common throughout most of the United States. It's for non-emergency calls as a general rule, but it's also used as a central number for call centers for information on protective measures or recovery after disasters as well. But it is also just a crisis hotline as well for folks who may be experiencing some need in their world at that moment.
Okay. And that is, yeah, that is good to know when it comes to the mitigation planning a little further on in the process. There's a comment regarding agency coordination. Is there additional context or information along with agency coordination to
Matt,
contribute?
this is the one about agencies working together seamlessly, being ready to respond. And the example that was provided in the chat was with the wildfires, there are a list of agencies that a team will need to call, such as Red Cross, Animal Services, and other response agencies. So that's where that one comes from.
Okay, so when it comes to the plan update itself, if it's not already within there, making it more clear that there is either a direction to the plan that accommodates that chain of command and list of contacts, or at least should be created.
Right. I would envision something like a playbook of sorts where, you know, whether it's a grab and go appendix or something that either is developed as part of the plan update or as an action item that comes out of it if it's not already included, and that, you know, that it's like a phone tree sort of communication strategy. Phone tree may not be the best example because phones may not always be available in these situations, but that's where I think we're wanting to go toward with regard to the agency coordination question.
Again, that's an emergency response plan, not a hazard mitigation plan. And short answer to that is yes, we do. That's what the EOCs are for. And so, but yeah, there it is.
So if I can address this for a minute, this is Kelly Hubbard. I'm the director of the County Office of Emergency Management, and really great suggestions and considerations being offered in regards to coordination and communications. And I appreciate and encourage attendees from the public to continue to provide such input. And some of these concepts are concepts that we do have addressed through our county and city and community planning that we have undertaken to ensure that we have coordination amongst agencies during these types of disasters. But again, it's really great to hear that you have these questions and considerations. And so what I'd love to do is not necessarily deter from hearing those additional recommendations and thoughts in this process, but also encourage some considerations of what are concepts that we can do prior to a disaster in terms of enhancing the community resiliency through infrastructure improvements, systems, whether those are communication systems. So when we talk about mitigation, we're talking about considering what we think are our biggest threats and how those are changing, and then what concepts can we put in place. So as we work on those communications and coordinations, as the question asked, you know, one of the things that I will think about is we do have a list that the county will utilize with Red Cross, Animal Services, and other response agencies. Are there ways I can enhance my resiliency in being able to communicate with them and ensure that even though that disaster happens, I have the ability to communicate with them regardless of impacts due to the disaster? And so in addition, going down and through the list, Erin, I believe, Arlen, mentioned disadvantaged communities and multilingual outreach. One of our considerations is how disasters can impact our disadvantaged communities more significantly. And so does anyone have ideas or thoughts on how to better engage that community in education, outreach, preparedness, possibly reduce the impacts to that community? And so just to continue moving back to that concept of what can we do in terms of technology, infrastructure improvements, and kind of more mitigation versus coordination of agencies, but what can we do to reduce that impact of that disaster? And so if you have some thoughts on how we can do that, that would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.
Hello, I have some ideas that I've heard from other regions that have gone through significant disasters and emergencies that I work with as part of my work in the Disability Disaster Access and Resources Program. And what they've done in other counties and other regions is they've coordinated their outreach with IHSS, the Public Health Authority, OEM, which you are, 211, and the area agencies on aging. So people that provide senior services receiving these planning mitigation, these plans ahead of time so that they're prepared for disasters and emergencies and they know where to go, or they're referred to their ILC for planning. These individuals can then prepare before disasters and emergencies happen.
Okay. And going back to Kelly's, well, in fact, Kelly, if you'd like to go ahead.
Oh, I was just clapping. I liked the response.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
For going, regarding Kelly's questions about how can we prevent or mitigate these disasters before they happen, going to the bare bones question of this HMP, what is the most threatening hazard to your community? What is the most threatening, what could happen at your home or your community that there's concern about and can be brought up so that this plan may help to mitigate or reduce the potential for that hazard to occur at your home or your community. And along those lines, I do wish that I could see the chat during this, but that'll be the
Matt, I
question.
can read you some of the other comments. There have been a couple of questions and comments in the chat. Kelly mentioned a possible solution for low tech communities could be evacuation sirens in tsunami and fire hazard zones. Aaron added, in addition to disadvantaged communities, multilingual outreach and engagement well in advance of an emergency assists overall effectiveness. Lauren added, needs for DAFN communities include AT equipment at shelters, accessible shelters, sign language interpreters, and personal assistants at the shelters. One reason why is the Mixteco community needs in-language support as it is not a written language and it needs to be spoken. Also, dietary needs need to be considered. Another aspect of that is backup power supplies for people with durable medical equipment that require backup power for the life of their life-saving medical equipment. And finally, the final comment was additional clean air centers and cooling and heating centers need to be established countywide. That's what you've missed in the chat. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you, Gina. And if there's anything additionally that shows up in the chat related to the hazards that most directly threaten your community, that can either be added to this Jamboard or spoken about in this environment.
Hello, it's me again, Lauren Utterback. The things that most threaten our the things that most threaten our community, especially because I serve the disabled community and the aging community, are floods, wildfires, earthquakes, and public safety power shutoffs. So the public safety power shutoffs are not categorized as a disaster or emergency. They're considered separate, and I recognize that. But for our community, with their power not working, it's a life or death situation. So that's something to be considered. For floods, I've heard that there are particular streets that are in need of renovation, essentially, because there can be floods in certain areas that somebody in a wheelchair or somebody with a mobility disability would not be able to get out of that situation. For wildfires, there are the tier 2 and tier 3 high risk fire areas that sort of surround the cities, going from my catchment area from San Luis Obispo all the way down to Ventura County. So just about every hazard is a threat to my community. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, the power safety shutoff is definitely something that's come up briefly during our internal discussions, particularly as it relates to the energy resiliency. And so when it comes to that and being prepared for those local hazard events, I'm curious for your department, for your role, what steps have been taken, or what additional steps do you think can be taken to help prepare for one of those events, whether it be backup power generators or yeah.
Thank you so much for asking. So I would say we are not privileged to the information of who is critical care. We don't have that information. They have to do an intake with us, and then we can provide them with a backup power solution if that works for them. There are people that have multiple devices, or people that are on palliative care that would not be suitable for a backup battery, in which case we can provide them with a hotel or motel stay if they're in a particular area that we can serve that. There are some areas that that's not possible due to different services provided by different utility companies, which is where we have our contracts. So there are some people that can get something called the Yeti 6000, and there are a few of those, and for some people they just aren't a good option. There are also Yeti 3000s. Those are slightly smaller, but they, again, will only last for maybe 5 hours for somebody with an oxygen concentrator. So there are certain things that we can do to help individuals with disabilities during public safety power shutoffs, such as getting their batteries recharged, getting them transportation, food, and also gas if they have their own generator, or if they have their own car, we can provide them with a gas voucher and food voucher, keeping in mind their dietary needs. All this is to say, the only thing that we really need to do is help our community prepare so that they know what they can do during disasters and emergencies, what to do before, what to do during, and what to do after. When I said that it would be great to have backup power supplies, I meant it would be great to have those at a shelter, because if the power runs out and they're on an oxygen concentrator, the battery that we could supply them with will only last 5 hours maximum. People have different medical equipment, people have different needs. So some people could have a battery that lasts them 5 days. Some people might have something that lasts them 5 hours, and it depends on what their needs are.
Okay. And related to that energy topic, over the past few years, there's been increased focus into privately owned power generation, such as solar panels. I realize that solar panels don't operate all day, but they can be used to help recharge batteries. Not that everything is going to be solved right now during this call, but just thinking about how that might be able to help for especially those shelters.
JD brings up an excellent point in the chat. He says, another example of a mitigation technique is a transfer switch, which is a device that when installed on a building will allow a mobile generator to be attached as needed to power the building. Does the group have any thoughts on that kind of method? I have some ideas about that. PG&E has something called the SGIP program, SGIP, where they will install a power wall inside of a building. There's also Swell Energy. They also have a wall of energy as well that they could install possibly at a shelter. So this would be a very long-term solution to this problem. So if we had designated shelters that we make sure they're accessible to every person with every disability, then we can ensure that the power wall will be there. And that would give us the opportunity to get their batteries recharged so that they can return to their home as soon as possible.
Matthew, one of the other, going to Kelly's point earlier with climate change, then you have situations like extended droughts. With that, you have increased wildfire hazard. You have, with the additional winds and that sort of thing, you can end up with extreme fire hazard. And what we experienced a couple of years ago was the smoke plumes, which, well, we don't have volcanoes here. I think in some cases it was pretty close to what I've experienced in volcanic fallout before, when we had the ash layer that literally covered over 4 counties from a single fire, and was a health hazard, hence the earlier comment about clean air shelters. The challenge I think that most of our communities have, well, at least in Santa Maria, is that not a single public facility that we have has a backup generator. And most of them do not have air conditioning either. So it would be a significant infrastructure challenge to retrofit, or in many cases, building new facilities to be able to handle those types of new needs. So when you're talking about community infrastructure, there's some significant impacts to our communities to do that. So it's great to have this input from everybody. Keep going, guys, because this is all stuff that needs to make it into our plan.
And as briefly mentioned during the presentation, one thing that can come out of this process is highlighting the actions that can be taken to reduce the potential for those impacts to be bad is to bring them up, like Lauren brought up the power issue for that vulnerable community. And so as an action item, there can be an action proposed and potentially receive FEMA funding or other similar funding to make these proposals a reality, which would be great. So along those lines, regarding the climate change and its effects on multiple hazards, the high heat events of Santa Maria and up there, are there specific actions or places that could receive additional infrastructure or proposals to address that issue?
I can bring up one component of this issue, and that's members of the Disability Access and Functional Needs community have temperature requirements for their disabilities, both for heat and for cold. So somebody with a disability might be severely negatively impacted based on a high temperature or extremely low temperature. So what Roy said about the infrastructure in place wouldn't be acceptable for somebody with those related disabilities. Going back to the backup power thing, people who require insulin are also users of our backup battery program. So keeping this in mind for the shelter, backup power is critical to their life-saving medical needs.
Okay, and so preparing for those local hazard events, whether it be a vulnerable population or a standard, a less vulnerable population, are there specific things that you or an agency you're affiliated with to prepare for that local hazard, to prepare for a wildfire or evacuation? Are there ways that you stay informed about local disasters? Yeah.
Matt, we got a few other comments in the chat I wanted to read in, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yes, please.
JD commented, another example of a mitigation technique is a transfer switch, which is a device that when installed on a building will allow the mobile generator to be attached as needed to power the building. Does the group have any thoughts on that kind of method? Lauren also posted a few useful links and then commented, members of the DAFN community have temperature requirements, both heat and cold, which we just talked about. JD also added, mitigation and resources don't need to be a physical item. It can be a program like vegetation fuels abatement in areas that are near wildland areas. Does anyone have a situation like that where a program could be created to mitigate hazards in your area? And then Lauren commented, people who require insulin are also users of our backup battery program, which is what she just brought up. So if anyone has thoughts on JD's questions about programs or methods, I think that'd be really useful to hear.
Thank you, Gina. And in fact, other examples of plans or programs that are implemented in the county is also useful because that can provide a branching off point to discuss other ways to address hazards. Of course, following this call, if you think of something or want to stay engaged afterwards, emails or phone calls to those that presented this workshop is welcome, and input, whether it be later this evening or 3 weeks from now. This program and process will be going on over the next few months, and we will be revisiting these things that have been talked about today. It's neat to have heard what's going on and concerns that we might be able to address throughout this process. And if there are no additional questions or comments or input, I have made it through my list of 7 questions I wanted to ask. And thank you all again for for attending this workshop.
Matthew, if I could just real quickly, for those who may be watching afterwards, at the beginning, there was your contact information, I believe, as well as the Office of Emergency Management names. And so if community members don't feel comfortable participating through the survey, they can reach out to the Office of Emergency Management or the participating agencies to provide some additional feedback and information to help contribute towards the planning process.
Sounds good. And I'll go back to the contact slide for this meeting. If anybody wants to write down or reach out, we'd be more than happy to take any additional input that comes in. And with that, is there any additional questions or input from JD, Mike, Kelly, Doug, Gina?
I'd just like to thank everybody. This is JD for attending. I know it's a little later in the evening, getting close to supper time, but the feedback that we get is the backbone of really making this a whole community plan that identifies perhaps what we're not looking at, or what local knowledge you have of your immediate area, or where you work, or where you frequent, to allow us to understand what's going on that much better. And so I strongly encourage, first of all, I thank all of you again for participating and being engaged. I strongly encourage each of you to visit the project webpage that is at readysbc.org underneath the hazard preparedness dropdown. And I believe the link for that is in the chat that was provided, as well as the survey. There is a written survey. Again, if you're not comfortable, voicing your thoughts or opinions in a public format like this, that survey is an awesome way to get that information from you. I ask that each of you consider sharing that survey and the link to the project page with your friends and family to get their feedback and their opinions. Each response we get only makes the plan that much better. And so thank you again for your engagement and for your help. We look forward to all of you and your friends and family continuing to be partners in this plan's process as we continue on with its development.
This is Mike Dyer. I agree with JD. Thank you all for contributing to this process. And we continue to hope that all of us are going to work together to make the community safer in the future. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I think we are going to end the recording and hope you all have a wonderful evening.